So, while you were at University of South Dakota, when did the direct revelation come about? Did it come about during that year, or when was this God telling you what He wants you to do?
So specifically for Morocco, that was two main revelations and then lots of confirmations. So the night that I got saved, I remember God telling me that He would send me.
This is in Mission.
Yep, in Mission, South
Okay.
Dakota in 2006. He said that He would send me to Africa in a couple of years. Unfortunately, I complicate the word couple because in my mind, I say I have a couple of Oreos, but that's like a sleeve, of 10 or 20 Oreos or something like that. And so I'm like, okay, God, like, is it 3, 4 years? Is it 2 years? And so I was asking God, okay, when do I go? What does this look like? And then a year later, in the summer of 07, I was working at Ingham Okoboji Lutheran Bible Camp. And I was at the Ingham site. And remember one day I was just walking from my cabin to the cafeteria.
Now, this is after being at University of South Dakota. You're listening to God's Word, you're playing music, you're going in Bible study, you're really exploring what is this biblical God in my life.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and even through that first year, I was involved in a couple different Bible studies. And one of them I was asking, how do we discern God's will? I remember I asked that specific question one day because I was just wrestling with this. I had actually gotten an invitation from Elizabeth Buchan. Well, her name's changed now. But Elizabeth Buchan went to Bethany and Lutheran in Spencer, and she was also on the trip with Dusty's church. And she had sent me this, I consider, random invitation and said, hey, this camp's looking for more counselors. Are you interested? And my first thought was, no way. But I just felt like the Holy Spirit kept impressing it upon me. And so I'm like, okay, is this God, or is this just my mind wrestling with something? Like, how do I know if God really wants me to do this? Well, through a bunch of neat things, God confirmed that He wanted me to apply to that camp. So I applied to the camp, got hired, was working there, and one day walked into the cafeteria, and in that, another revelation, a vision, just everything went white, and it seemed like time stopped and everything else just disappeared. And I just heard God saying, Jeremy, you've been praying about when to go. I want you to leave next June, and I want you to go like the disciples. Don't take any extra money or extra clothes. Just trust me and go, and I'll get you there. And so now I had a more definitive timeline of when to go. Still didn't know exactly where I was going or how I'd get there, but knew the way that I was supposed to go to. So then went back to college, got more involved with crew, more involved with the church.
What was your major?
So I went initially with, I want to say it was a vocal performance and history major. Dropped the vocal performance and kept the history, but I started trying to do an emphasis on ancient agriculture, of trying to learn how they had farmed in the past, so that hopefully I could take practices that would be applicable at any place in the world, not dependent upon technology. You don't have to have tractors, you don't have to have electricity and pumps or whatever, but just using what they've got to use as a way to help people and have ways of kind of ends in different countries. So I was studying that, was studying Spanish, French, and it was actually through, I told my pastor at the church I was going to about what God was calling me to do. He at first thought I was crazy. And then he started thinking through the Bible. He's like, you know what? God has asked people in the past to do stuff like this. Maybe this is the Lord. How about we do some discipleship, get in the Word together and pray, and have some time of mentorship. And so we started doing that. And after a while, he's like, yeah, I think God's telling you to do this. Why don't you talk with another elder in our church? He was from Holland, was a teacher or involved in the college in some way there, and he had a college roommate that was a missionary in Morocco. And he's like, maybe it's nothing, but maybe it could be a good connection to have, or a good first stop. And so that's how I got connected through this missionary, eventually with the orphanage in Morocco.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that was during that year after
After the Bible college.
After
Or sorry,
the-
no, after the...
no after the mission.
Well, so there's the mission, there's a year of college, then there was the revelation at the camp in '07, and then meeting with the elder and
Yep.
the pastor and continued discipleship before I took off in June of '08.
Okay, so during that year, now you're doing agriculture. You had someone that had a connection to Morocco that you started following through on, and it led you to the orphanage. Once you found out about the orphanage, you felt a lot more convinced that was where God was calling you?
No.
No?
I tried to reach out to the orphanage, like sent emails, tried other different ways of communication, and heard nothing back. And this was months and months in advance. Didn't find out until later on, that the reason why I didn't hear back from them is because they had no internet for several months because of the poverty there. People would climb up telephone poles and cut down the telephone lines, and this is back when it's dial-up and yeah.
The copper.
Yeah, so they were going for the copper, and so they didn't get my emails for several months until actually after I was in Morocco. So I heard nothing from them, had no connection or communication, and so my thought was, I'll head there, I'll show up at the doorstep, and if they say no, or if God says no, like I'll just continue on for there, but I'll just use it as a jumping off point.
Okay. Now, during that second year at USF, University of South Dakota, where were your parents at? Where was your family at? Now, you talked about them really struggling with their calling. Now you got a more particular calling.
Yeah.
How are they responding to that?
That was the second year, well, both years, but really that second year was probably the worst. One of the toughest parts in my spiritual walk. I was getting the Bible even more frequently, in Bible studies, growing, just leaps and bounds, started picking up a guitar so I could help out with worship, and just wanted to worship the Lord in that way. And this whole time, my family, particularly my parents, there was a lot of chaos. Not that there was bad things going on at home, but just in what they saw me doing and the way I was going. My sisters thought I was part of a cult. My one sister tried to convince my parents that I'd lost my mind and maybe needed to be committed, institutionalized. And so my parents, thinking that, I'm just going to take off for Africa with no clothes, no money, no, sure plan or destination or anything like that, they were worried for my safety and my sanity. So they tried to have all the different missionaries and pastors and whatever friends and connections that they had and had try to come and talk to me. And so it seemed like every weekend, every other weekend, someone would come to the college and visit me, and that my parents had said and asked, hey, would you meet with so-and-so? And I was wrestling with, okay, I honor my mother and father, but at the same time I know what God's telling me to do, so I'll do these. And but didn't have a whole lot of faith in what would come out of this stuff. But anywho, I think, as I remember at least, every conversation I had, without exception, when those people left, they were convinced that God was telling me to do it too. And so they showed up thinking maybe I was a little off or not following the Lord, but because it's not something that God asked everybody to do either. But yeah, I remember each of them leaving and being like, all right, like, God, yeah, I might be telling you to do this, and you're not.
Was that giving you more validation then?
It did, and even though it was the opposite of what they had intended, it did. And then it seemed, especially that second year, that every day I would just be doubting for different reasons. If God really wanted me to do this, or how would He come through, or how would He guide or provide, and all this. And it seemed like every day there would be an email, there would be a Bible verse. I had like a Bible verse calendar on your desk type thing. You just rip off a sticky note, and it was either that or what I read in the Word or something, a Bible study or church, and it's just whatever I needed for the encouragement, God would always show up with. And so that whole year was incredibly tough, or I guess 2 years leading up to that, but God kept growing me.
Do you think those 2 years of that challenge prepared you for the travel? Because the travel, when we'll get to it,
Uh-huh.
that from my memory, that was filled with a lot of failures, a lot of, it wasn't as you expected.
Mm-hmm.
And then God opened up another door in a different way.
I would say it prepared me for travel in the sense that I knew without a shadow of doubt that God was telling me to do this. I just didn't know the how. You know, I knew that even the when too, but it was just that reassurance that okay, I'm not wrong in this, and this is what God wants me to do.
When did you start experiencing the tangible, God told me to give you this, that started preparing you physically for the trip? Was that not until close to the trip, or did things start happening throughout that second year that you had to start receiving things that you had to put aside for this event?
So for the actual trip, none of that happened until maybe a week before.
A week before the trip?
Yeah.
Wow. So it's like that story, you know, where they, once you put your foot in the water in the Bible, then God will make the path available.
Yeah. Up
Okay.
until then, I remember there's been lots of different prayer requests that I had that God grew my faith for sure, and getting the word and just beautiful moments with Him. But it wasn't until about a week before the trip, and the first one, I was up at the Bible camp. They would have church services there in the summertime, and I'd been involved in our church in Spencer and serving there a bunch and throughout the summer, but just with I was living at home. I was living at home for that particular summer because I knew I was going to be leaving in June. My sister was getting married. There was lots of stuff to help do and prep for that, and so I felt oppressed, and so I needed to get away, get out. I was like, I'm just going to go to this camp. I know.
So your parents are not convinced yet, even though
No.
they sent all these missionaries, they came back and said, I think God's talking to
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
So they still weren't convinced. They weren't as, how do you put it? They weren't like on the warpath necessarily, but they weren't for it either, and they would still ask questions and try to, I don't know if it was sow doubt or what, but like speak sense into, I don't know. So yeah, about the week before, went to the camp, and I didn't say specifically what was going on, but just they have a time at the beginning of the service where they ask if anyone has any prayer requests. And I said, hey, I'm getting ready to do a trip that I believe the Lord's called me on, and I would just love prayer. And after that service, a lady comes up to me and hands me a check for $100 and says, I believe God told me to give this to you for the trip. And the night before...
So it was a check.
I believe it was a check, yeah.
Ah.
Yeah. And, so the night, is either the night before or 2 nights before, I'd been reading in Joshua, actually about the exact story that you're talking about, of how they had to step in first. And so I felt like God was telling me that I needed to step into the water, so to speak, and then I would see the provision. And so I had been reading a book, I forget the name of it right now, but it was the author lived out in Philadelphia, and he had been doing a bunch of different neat ministries that I really wanted to check out. I thought I could hit that up maybe on the way, and I was like, that could be a good first step. So I bought a plane ticket the night before, pretty sure, for $99. And so then when the lady gave me the check for $100, it's like, all right, well, God, you've provided exactly what I needed with a little bit left over. And also then at the camp, another friend came up to me, and she was going to college. She was a counselor with me the previous summer. That summer she was a counselor again, and I think she knew a little bit more of the details, and she gave me $400 and says, I feel like God was willing to lay this on me. And I said, no way, like, you're a poor college student. I know what you're going through and all this stuff, like, you can't do this. And she's like, don't deny me the joy of giving. You know, it's more blessed to give than receive. And so she's like, I want to have a part of this mission trip, and so let me give this to you. So those were the first two provisions before I actually hopped on a plane.
So, and your father took you to Omaha for the plane?
Yep. So my dad and I drove down to Omaha. It was a really early flight, if I remember right. So I think we even stayed at a friend's house or, well, it was his parents then, because he was off doing something for the summer, but we stayed there, and then he dropped me off, and it was a really quiet car ride.
Out to there.
Yeah, out to there. But then, yeah, that day I took off. I want to say it was the last day in June, because God never said a specific date. And so I was just like, all right, I don't leave. And my sister got married June 21st, I want to say. It was end of June, so I wanted to be there for that. And so yeah, that was like the last day in June. I hopped on a plane, headed for Philly.
When you went to Philly, what did you had your passport with you,
Mhm.
and just you had no clothes with you? Or?
I had a toothbrush, toothpaste, my passport, and the clothes on my back. I didn't have a backpack. I didn't have any additional clothes like stuffed in my pockets. I had some cargo pants because I thought pockets are good, and I'm headed to Africa, and so I want something that covers everything but also not too hot.
But you did not have a ticket to Africa. You
No.
just had a ticket to Philadelphia.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I must have had my debit card, and yeah, passport, because then I know I did make some other purchases with the debit card, and I'm trying to think if, I don't think I had any other monies or things on me.
Okay.
So
When did your parents come on board?
I'd say after what happened in Philly.
Okay, so let's talk about what happened in Philly.
So
Oh, and by the way, what during this year, what has kind of become your natural wearing of clothes? Because there was something physically that you were starting to project too, wasn't there? About what you'd wear and how you dress each and every day?
in college, initially I dressed very, I don't know what you would call it, fancy. I wore a lot of button-up shirts, a lot of sweater vests. I know towards the end, as I was getting ready for Morocco, I wanted to dress more, I don't know, how I thought would fit in over there. I don't think that really affected what I wore until I got on the plane, because
What about the white t-shirts?
yeah, the white
Yeah.
T-shirt was that actually kind of became my MO for a while. But I started wearing a lot of white T-shirts because one, they're cheap. I can buy a 12-pack or something like that. It was simple. You didn't have to think about what you put on. Just throw on a white T-shirt and maybe a sweater over top or something. And so yeah, I took off for Morocco with a brand new white clean T-shirt because I didn't know the next time I was going to get it washed, and the cargo pants, and I think I had a sweater of some sort just in case, and that was it. So when I got to Philly, then I was sharing my story with whoever because I was freaked out. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I thought maybe if I share my story with somebody that God will open up a door and make a connection or whatever. Well, as I'm on the flight, the person I'm sitting next to, they thought it was a crazy story, but that's kind of about it. But there was a lady behind us that was eavesdropping, overhearing what we were saying. And when we got off the plane, she asked if she can buy me lunch and hear more about the story. And so we do that at the airport. She gives me a few dollars that she has on her, and off she goes. And so I'm sitting there wondering what to do. Well, I try to go and make connections with the author and the group of people in Philly.
Was that the Koinonia group?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I thought I'll do some sightseeing, exploring. Did that the first day and didn't know what to do, didn't make any connections.
You didn't have a round trip ticket, you just had a one-way ticket
Yeah.
to Philly.
Yep. And so I found a church in kind of the downtown area that was going to have a Bible study that night. And then the sign outside said Bible study and snacks. And I was hungry, so, and Bible study and Christians, and I thought, that sounds good. So I ended up going to the Bible study. They had some speaker. And afterwards, the pastor and I were chatting. And he said, hey, I'll give you a ride back to the airport. So he gave me a ride back to the airport. Because I was thinking, hopefully I'll make a connection there, and God will lead me on. If I'm supposed to get to Africa, the airport makes the most sense. And he gave me a few more dollars, and so I spent the night at the airport. Nothing happened. The next day, I really felt like God was impressing upon me I needed to head back to a park I'd seen the first day. And so I argued with him for a while because it was going to take like $7 or something to take the train back down to the park, which was kind of near, was it like Liberty Hall?
Yep, yep.
And, but finally, God convinced me, you know, I showed up with nothing, and now I've got a few dollars in my pocket. Who provided that? He did. Who could provide more? He can. So I go down, and I'm just sitting in the park, enjoying the sunshine, singing some songs to God. I might have had like a pocket Bible with me. I'm pretty sure I did. And so I'm sitting in the park, clean white t-shirt, and singing and probably looking like a total weirdo. And this flight attendant is walking his dogs and sees me, and his dogs really want to come to me for whatever reason. And at first he thought I was a druggie or whatever, but then he's like, his shirt's too clean. And there was something else too. But anywho, so we had a chat, and that was the next big step in the trip. Yeah, should I just go?
Yeah, keep
All
going.
Right. So him and I are chatting. I'm thinking I should share the gospel with this guy because I've been trying to do that with several different people on the trip, and find out he's a born again Christian. He's, I want to say, originally from Minnesota, and his parents have a cabin, or used to have a cabin in the lakes area. And so we were finding out these things in common. He's asking about the trip, and then he says, well, I'm a flight attendant. I just got back. I've been flying between the U.S. and England a bunch. He says, let me look into tickets over to Africa. Says, can you meet me at this place in, I can't remember if it was an hour or a couple hours or something like that. And so I say, sure. I had some money on me, so I went and got some food, because at that point I hadn't been eating much because I was worried I wanted to make whatever I had stretch. And I remember, I think I went and found some, like a military surplus place and bought like charcoal tablets, because I'm like, all right, I'm going to Africa, I got some money, I should have these just in case I eat something bad or whatever. And I bought like a little survival kit, and had some money left over, so bought some pizza for myself and some homeless guys on the street. And so meet the guy up, and a little while later, and he tells me I've got good news and bad news. The good news is I can get you a ticket to Madrid, but he says, but that's also the bad news, is that that's as close as our airline gets. And it's, what do they call that? Like a standby, you know, and it's one of the discount tickets that we get, so you still have to pay 10% of the cost. But because it's so last minute, it's also going to be 10% of the ticket is $400. It's a $4,000 ticket. And he says that, and I wasn't sad at all, because I'm like, well, I just happen to have money, you know, $400 that was given to me right before I left, so I can pay that no problem. He's like, okay, well, if you're okay with it, tonight you can sleep in my apartment, and I've got a safari pack that I took to Africa like a year or so ago, and I'll fill it up with a whole bunch of clothes I was just going to donate to like Goodwill or something. And I can get you a whole bunch of like first class soaps and shampoo, little travel size things, and toothbrush and toothpaste, and we'll set you up. And so we go back to his place. He gave me his Metro card so I could go and ride out that evening and spend some time with the Koinonia group that I'd connected with. And we went to watch Shawshank Redemption at the first penitentiary in the U.S.
Oh, Eastern State Penitentiary.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's an incredible tour.
Yeah, so we went there, we went and ended up grabbing some Italian ice cream, I think, afterwards, and just had a good time of fellowship, and came back to his place, and he set me up with a red backpack that's actually hanging in my office, and stuffed it full of clothes and first class travel size shampoos and stuff, so they'll make it past security, because then that backpack I could just check, or not check, but put as a carry-on. And the next day he got me on the train back to the airport, and I was on a plane headed for Madrid, Spain.
So you're on and this is where your mother and father said, okay.
Yeah, I called them up that night and told them, you know, what had happened, the provision, and they, I mean, still weren't excited about it necessarily, but they saw God making connections and God providing, and that maybe I wasn't totally crazy. And I had at least an address and a location that I was heading into in Africa that there was some connections with, and so it didn't seem all that bad. So.
And is that when your mother started the Caring Bridge site?
I think so. I think it was around that time.
Belinda, right? Delinda. Sorry,
Yeah.
Delinda.
That's right.
And so she started the Caring Bridge site, which allowed some of us who knew about you, she started sharing your journey,
Yeah.
which was incredible for people that weren't as connected to you.
Yeah.
And that was such a blessing for her doing that. So she started that. So you were regularly checking in with your mom on this trip.
When I could.
When you could, exactly. So
Yeah.
you flew out to Madrid, and now where you are at Madrid, you have the Rock of Gibraltar, and you have Morocco. You have, you're not far away, but how did you end up in Morocco?
So on the plane, again, I just continue to share the gospel and share my story with whoever will listen. As I'm not as worried at this point, but just excited and wanted to share with people. I wanted to see God use this to impact people. Ended up, maybe not much happened on the plane. Get to Madrid, and there's a musician on the plane who needs to get to this hotel. Doesn't speak Spanish. I took a lot of Spanish in college and high school, and even a mission trip in between my freshman sophomore year to Ecuador, and so I wasn't fluent, I'd say, but I was proficient, and so I offered to help her get to her hotel. So did that, and she ended up, as a thank you, giving me some euros and one of her CDs. She was going to be playing at this big conference. I don't remember what the conference was, but it was supposed to be something big to do. And the flight attendant had also, that I'd stayed with, had given me some euros. He said he mostly flies between England, so it's using the pound, and the US, so the dollar, so he didn't need the euros. So I had, I don't know, maybe 40 euros on me or something. And I asked people, what's the fastest and cheapest way to get across Spain? Get down to the coast and get over to Africa. And they said, take the bus. So I bought a bus ticket, but it didn't leave till that night. So I spent the day just kind of exploring the city, took some walking tours. Had a giant baguette that was like 3 feet long, and had some, I think, chocolate from the very first chocolate place in all of Europe. So got to do some neat things, and then that night hopped on the bus, took the bus on down, met the guy who was sitting next to me, and he said he's heading to Morocco, and said he'd kind of show me the ropes as far as how to get on the ferry and go through customs and get into Morocco, and so by that time that used up all of my money. I had just pennies left, but I got to, what was it, the train station in Morocco. The different people had led me and guided me how to get to there, and at that point, this would have been July 4th, after all these different days of travel. I go up to the ticket booth. I'll never forget this. I asked the guy, I'm like, I don't speak Arabic. Do you speak English or Spanish? And the guy says to me in perfect English, no, this is Morocco. We only speak French and Arabic here. And then he starts laughing kind of like you, and he says, I'm just messing with you. What can I do for you? And I'm like, well, I need to get to, I knew the name of the village where this orphanage was at. What's the closest I can get there, and how much will it cost? And he's like, well, what do you have for money? And I tell him, he's like, well, there's an exchange place right over there. So I go and get the money exchanged and come back and find out that the dollar compared to the dirham is a very good exchange rate. And so I had a decent amount of money left. I think I had like $7, and it was like 110 dirham. And so I was able to get a ticket as close as I could to Ainlu. And so I'm waiting at the train station, and I'm overwhelmed by all the different smells, the spices, the dresses, as it's more of a Muslim country, and so everything's different. I'm just looking for something familiar, and at this point I really don't have much money because I used most of the money for the ticket. And I see these white guys in the station, and I'm thinking, well, there's a good chance they speak English. And I go up next to them, and I hear them talking, and yeah, they're from England. And so I said, hey guys, I'm just excited to find someone else that speaks English. And they start just handing me food and say, hey, how you doing? And they're asking stories and swapping stories, and they're just I think it was 3 high school, college age guys that were just kind of backpacking around the Mediterranean. And so they say they're taking the same train as me, they're going in the same direction, they're going to go a little further than I'm going, but we can ride together, and they just keep handing me food this whole time. And so we have a blast. We get to share stories and eating, which was great. And sure enough, I get to, was it Meknes? And they continue on the train, and I get off and take a couple of cabs, and at like 8 o'clock at night, July 4th, I end up at the steps of the orphanage. And yeah, I'm trying to remember how.
Knock on the door and they answer. And
Yeah, they answer, and I tell them who I am, and they say, we don't know you, we can't accept strangers at Northridge, it's not safe, so good night and go away.
Good luck. Go away.
So I end up in the neighboring village, because the orphanage was kind of in the country, which is called Einlu, spelled just like my last name, Lou, except for I think there was an H on the end. And I find a guy who owns a little hotel, and I think it was the only hotel in town, because the town was only a couple thousand people. And I tell him, hey, like, I got nothing for money left. I've been hitchhiking rides and stuff here. I just need a place to stay. Can I sleep on the couch just to get off the street? Just feel a little safe in the lobby or something. He's like, yeah, I can let you do that. And he says, and if you'll help me with my English, which I'm talking with him through Spanish, he says, if you'll help me with my English, I'll give you some food too tomorrow. And so we started doing that. I would teach English lessons, and he'd feed me, and other people started coming, and they'd bring food, and then he eventually gave me a room in the hotel and just let me stay there. And then, as you had mentioned earlier, some of the religious leaders from the area started showing up because they heard this random American's here, and he's sharing the gospel and
A
other
little
stuff.
bit louder.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, having conversations every evening with these Muslim religious leaders in the area, and teaching English throughout the day, and getting fed, and having a place to stay.
Do you have some good debates?
Yeah. I don't know if I'd say debate so much as me just, because I knew the Bible better at that point, but not incredibly well. But my testimony, they can't argue that, you know? And so that was something I've discovered very early on, that, you know, I serve and follow a living God who talks and interacts. And, you know, whether I knew the right scriptures or not, I could tell them, this is what's happened to me, and this is how God has worked, and he's alive and active. Does your God speak to you? Does your God interact with you or guide you? And that was tough for them to argue against, or to come back with anything against. And so, but it was all friendly conversations, and we had good food, and through a bunch of random connections, I ended up back at that orphanage again several days later. Maybe it was a week or two, and they'd finally gotten the emails and figured out who I was, and had the kind of references and stuff. And so, yeah, a week or 2 weeks later, I was at the orphanage and had my own house. Had a
What
meal
did
plan.
the orphanage director say to you? Because you said God gave you a specific. You're going to be in Africa for 3 months.
He just said head to Africa, so I didn't know
Oh,
how long I was
you
going to
didn't
be
know
there.
how long.
I had a tourist visa, which allowed me to go anywhere, and I could stay in each country up to 3 months usually.
Oh,
Usually 90
okay.
days is what you're given. And so after 90 days, I'd have to leave Morocco, but I could leave and come right back, and it'd start over again.
Oh, okay.
Or I could go on to another country. And so when I was talking with the director, he said, hey, we heard who you are, we know your background, we know you have some agricultural background and construction, because I'd worked with my dad, who's a carpenter. And he said, our maintenance guy has just left, and our next one doesn't show up for 3 months. So if you'll fill in that time gap, like, we'd appreciate it, and we'd have a place for you, and we'll feed you lunch every day, because we all eat collectively lunch. So then you just got to figure out something for breakfast and supper, and we'll let you stay in one of our houses where all of our visiting teams come, and they'll probably help feed you and kind of take care of you too, and you can help them learn the lay of the land and how to survive here. Because when the teams would come, they'd be sometimes for a couple of days, but sometimes they'd be there for several weeks or months. And so then my job was,
So what are these teams?
so we just mission teams, kind of like YouthWorks, except for they were coming from churches, they were coming from different organizations, they were individuals, they were people that were scoping out the orphanage to see if they were going to move there. And
What's the parameters of the orphanage? What if you were going to be a part of the orphanage? What did you commit to? What was that mission?
it depended on what your role was. If you were going to be a family who would then, in essence, kind of adopt kids, you would get 8 kids given to you over a period, and you would commit to 25 years with the orphanage. And you'd get 8 kids, and you raise them from almost birth until 18. And so over, what was that, 7 years, you'd get 8 kids given to you, so it was kind of gradual, so you got to kind of take them in like a family, and then you would raise them like your own, and if you had kids or not, it didn't matter. And then you were given a house, or at least part of a house, on the premise, and then you'd have an additional role within the orphanage, whether they had a school, so you could be a teacher, they had a clinic, so if you had a medical background, you could be involved with that. Some of them were more involved with logistics, whether it was, they had some workers in the kitchen, they had a few different workers, they had orchards and farmland where they were trying to become self-sufficient, and so some guys would help with that.
So there was some good irrigation and waters
Yep.
that you can have access to. A lot of times when we think of Morocco, we think of Africa, we think of something dry and you know.
In Morocco there was an irrigation system that you had to, because I only remember it raining a couple times when I was there. It's very hot, very dry, but where we were at was also kind of up in the mountains, so they would actually see snow in the wintertime. It was, I mean, kind of like Colorado in the same sense that snow, like if you're in Denver, it hits and it's gone within a day or two. It was very much that, and it wouldn't get crazy cold. In the winter, you know, maybe 20s. When I was there, it was, 100 plus, usually during the day. It was a dry heat, so it didn't feel so bad.
Were you able to sleep at nights?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And I mean, you had like linens over you. You didn't have blankets.
Yeah.
Not until the fall when I was still there, then I started to maybe use a blanket. And I have windows oftentimes open during the night just to help create a cross breeze. Because we had no AC, no heat. Trying to remember if there was a fireplace or something like that. Because I think some of them had fireplaces and maybe even like some baseboard, like boiler system to heat the other houses. But where I was at, I don't think we had any sort of heat. And you had a tank on the roof that you would fill up by hand, and then that was your water supply for as long as that lasted. And so I'd borrow a vehicle and drive up to the spring where it came out of the side of the mountain, and there was aqueducts that would guide the water to different fields and homes, but animals would drink from there, and people would wash clothes in there, and all sorts of stuff, so you never wanted to get your drinking water from there. So you have to go to the source. So you fill up these big, I don't know if they were 20-gallon jugs or something like that with water, and put the lid on, drive them back to the house, go up the stairs and fill up this tank that held, I don't know, 1,000 gallons or something like that, and do however many trips you have to, and lug them up and down the stairs until you fill up the tank.
Wow.
So that meant...
And that community, so you're by a town, and that area is very Muslim.
Yep.
But your orphanage was a Christian orphanage.
Yep.
How did that orphanage even come into being?
So there had been a long history, but the guy who was the director was connected with Brother Andrew in Open Doors, if you've ever heard of that. God's Smuggler was a book that he wrote about how they tried to get the gospel into close countries. Originally it was Soviet, communist countries, but then they expanded to Muslim countries too. And so the guy who had helped found this had been doing that, and this was kind of his retirement plan. Still a closed country, but because of the clinic, because of the school, because they took in kids, oftentimes the kids they got were in Muslim country. If you have a child out of wedlock, that's cause for the death penalty. And so if women got pregnant before they were married, they would hide the pregnancies and then take off for a vacation from family for a week or so, have the baby, and then throw it away, or if there was an orphanage, drop it on the steps. And so they got tons and tons of babies with that were malnourished and just dropped on their steps overnight and stuff like that. And the government, because they knew that they were doing these things and helping out the community in the area, let them exist for a while. Shortly after I left, they closed down that orphanage and several other places and kicked all the foreign workers out. But at that point in time, they were letting us operate, but we had to follow the rule of no proselytizing. So this meant we can't just walk up to people and share the gospel. If they ask us questions, if we do things in such a way that they're curious about us and why we're doing this stuff, or why are we loving upon these kids that they considered rejects and discards, if they asked questions, we could talk. And so we had our own church service, and there were some workers that started coming to that, and there was people in the community that started.
So there were people from the community that worked at the orphanage
Yep.
then?
Mhm.
They're from the Muslim background?
So they provided jobs for Muslims too. They worked in the kitchen. I worked with a guy out in the fields and in the orchards, and so they were kind of allowed to exist. Yeah, and it had been planted by, there was a lady that was involved, but then also this guy from Open Doors, and then another guy that was from South Africa. Those three kind of.
But then you said a couple of years after you're there, they closed it down.
Yeah, well, they kicked all the foreign workers out, and the local government took over the orphanage and school and clinic and stuff like that. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So the kids got kind of ripped out of their families because, like I said, they were almost adopted in. You couldn't adopt Muslims as a non-Muslim, and so they were just, I don't want to call it foster, because it was more like family units, not just a big random building. But it was a neat community. Village of Hope was the name of it.
I'm probably going to come down more times and have the other stories,
Okay.
but that's not going to be for today. I would like to hear how God's Word is guiding you now.
Mm-hmm. So, you're talking specifically about the Bible, right?
Yeah, but before we get there, you spent those 3 months and then headed home,
Mm-hmm.
and then you moved on and with the ministry God has called you to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was nothing spectacular on the way back. That was, you fulfilled God's word, His mission for you, and then headed home and just kept your mind open and said, okay, what's next, God?
So actually, even before that, when I was in Morocco, I was praying about what's next, because I knew I had 3 months. I'd actually just left the country and come back in and started the new 90-day process. But I felt like He was laying something on my heart, and I didn't know. And so I started asking God, okay, do you want me to go somewhere else in Africa? I kind of felt like this inkling to go back into youth ministry for a while and in the States. And I was just praying one night at my house there near the orphanage, and I remember hearing God say, the mountains of South America. And that's all He said, no explanation. And I know what that meant. So the next day I was at the orphanage. I think it was a Saturday. I was getting worship music ready because I was starting to lead the worship at the little church service that we have. And one of the missionaries comes up, Eddie Padilla, and he comes up to me, and he'd never said anything to me like this before. And he says, Jeremy, I feel like God told me to tell you to go to Bible college. And he said, the only ones I know and trust are Calvary chapels, and they've got locations all over the world. And he starts listing off, they got some in Spain, and they're in Germany, and they're in America, and they're in Peru, and I heard Peru, and I'm like, okay, I know that's South America, and I'm pretty sure there's mountains there. So I'm like, maybe, but, and I remember sitting there, and he talked about prayer, and so he leaves, and I'm chewing on this, because I'm like, okay, maybe not, God hasn't said it to me, He hasn't confirmed it to me. I'm like, God, if you really want me to go, then I don't think I even said it. I think I was just thinking it. And I was looking at a specific window pane in the windows. I'm like, God, if you want me to do this, then make a bird fly across that window pane. And boom, bird shoots across the window pane.
Oh, Gideon's fleece.
Yeah. And so I'm like, okay, probably God, but just in case, God, give me some additional signs to know that this is you. And so He, later that week, I can't remember if it was the next day or what, 6 Calvary Chapel Bible College students show up at the orphanage, and they're going to be there for the next while. And they're going to live in the house with me. Actually, I think I moved to a different house at that time period, and I was supposed to help them acclimate and figure out how to buy food and stuff at the market, and how to bathe and wash dishes, because with limited water, there's certain tricks and stuff you need to learn. And so I'm talking with these students, finding out that they're from campuses all over the world. Some of them went to Germany, some of them went to Israel, some of them went to California. None of them have been to the California one, or the the Peruvian one, but they've heard good things about it, and they know some of the teachers and some of their friends went there. And so they're telling me what they have heard about, amazing things. And so finally, after a while, I'm like, okay, God, this is the sign I needed.